I want to talk about Seaside. It's a web framework, but it's built in Smalltalk, which, as some of you know, there's a lot of Smalltalk ideas that were carried over into Ruby. So some of these things you might see somewhat familiar. To pique your interest, I have a quote from some blogger who tries to compare Seaside to Rails. And it's not that there's the Seaside and Rails people are fighting each other. Actually, Rails has a lot of interesting things. Avi Brandt, who created Seaside, talked at RubyConf. So I think there's a lot of admiration on both sides. It's just that Seaside tried to do something different than what Rails is trying to do, and which makes it somewhat interesting. And there's some background. Yeah, it's written in Smalltalk. And Smalltalk in various forms is cross-platform, so you can run Seaside on Windows, Mac OS, Unix, Linux, etc. And it's an open source free framework. And a couple of things, it makes it different. First of all, it is written in Smalltalk, which is not your sort of mainstream language. So that makes it an oddball a little bit. They don't use a templating system, which is fairly common these days. And they don't necessarily use meaningful URLs. You start to see it's slightly different. And so the outline for the talk, I'll give you a little background on Smalltalk, a very brief introduction to syntax. I'll show you some of the major features of the framework. One is we can write an entire session and a method, live debugging, how they do the callbacks, and some of the development tools and how they work. So, 2 slides worth of Smalltalk syntax. Smalltalk methods are slightly different. For the Ruby people, this is no big deal. When I have a method with no argument, in language like Java, you have this empty parentheses, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So in Smalltalk, you just get rid of the parentheses, right? There's no need for it. Also, there is this, quite commonly, a period which separates the receiver from the message. In Smalltalk, it's a space. So when we have a single argument, what Smalltalk does is they use a colon, and then they list the argument, and here the $ indicates a single character in Smalltalk as opposed to some other sequence. The thing that really bothers people initially is if we have a method with more than one argument, like we do here, in Smalltalk, that is a single method. And that method has a keyword, a colon, the first argument, and then another keyword, a colon, and a second argument. That's one method call, which takes a while. Like, wait, there's 2 syntactic pieces there. How can it be one method? And the idea is, when they created Smalltalk, they wanted to make it readable, right? They wanted the intent of what you're trying to do to become very obvious. And so they wanted each argument to have a keyword to tell you what that argument's for, right? So we don't have to worry about, well, what's the first argument for, what's the second argument for? The keywords tell us that. Okay, so a little syntax. I want to show you this because I want to show you some examples, so they won't quite so strange. Defining a method. In Smalltalk, as opposed to Ruby, you have to declare your variables, but you don't give them. There's no typing as in Ruby, right? So here I'm just declaring y to be a variable. That's it. Periods are used to indicate the end of a statement or statement separator. Colon equals, the assignment operator. And then things like if true, if false, these if statements are actually message sends as opposed to being part of the syntax of the language. And then we have the square brackets indicate a block, right? As you do, we have in Ruby, we've got blocks, and so this is a block. And the up arrow of the caret is just to, how you say return. So far, so good. So let's look at an example of using now Seaside, which is the web framework, right? And I want to look at how do we manage sessions. And I want to just use a very simple example. I want to create 3 pages. The first page says, look, enter a first number. Next, when you click OK, you get the second page, which says, OK, enter a second number. And the third page then gives you the sum, right? So use that as an example to show how things are different in Seaside. Now, of course, in lots of frameworks, what you would do is you would create 3 separate templates or web pages, right? And so here are some sort of fake pages. The first one, has some sort of form action, and it has these input types, and you hit the button, and then that somehow gets sent to, right, some controller, right, back in your, right, on the server, and then the server then sends you back, right, your second page, which has, in this case, hidden values, and then you hit submit, and it goes back to the server, and then, right, which means your application gets spread across several controllers and multiple pages, right? And this is just common. Now let's look at how we do that in the Seaside example. And at first it's going to be very hard to understand what's going on here. This is a single method, right? And it will display all 3 of those pages. So when this method is executed, this self request, it generates a web page. It sends it back to the client, and this method then is suspended until the user enters the number and clicks OK. And then the request comes back, and this method resumes. The self-request then extracts the value the user entered, returns it in number 1, and then we execute, right, the self-request second number, which then sends back a page to the user, and this method is suspended again until the user clicks the OK button or the session times out. When the user clicks the OK button, we come back, we resume this method, and then we execute the last sum and last line, and that also returns the result page, which is a completely different idea, right? I mean, this is not how frameworks typically work. And the nice thing is now we have a method which shows us the flow of control of how our application is running. It also allows us to do very interesting things where there are times when you have a bunch of pages, right? And at a certain point, when you click on the submit this to our billing agency, right? You don't want them to be able to use the back button to go back to those pages. So we can actually have one page which controls the session, and when you go past a certain point, you can say, I'm sorry, but you can't backtrack. And that logic is in one place. So far, so good? Yeah, this resuming is done with continuations, yeah. Yeah. This does consume more memory than it used to, which means that, your hardware will run up to the limit sooner. They're currently working on that to allow you to only use continuations when you actually need them. And there are some commercial applications using this, and they don't have a problem scaling that much. I mean,
how do you handle branching
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're going to scale up more hardware, you have to send these requests to the original machine.
Yeah, that is true. So you need some special processing in the front end to. But that, again, that's people done that, and it's not that hard. I mean, it's something you have to work on. Okay. I want to look at that example to show you some of the things we can do, and let's see if I can now. So yeah, let's look at. There's add my numbers. Here's. Can you see this? There. So this is the example. Here's my first page, enter the first number. So let's see, do a 1, and let's do a 2. And no, I got an error message, right? I got an exception occurred on my server. And now, and so we see the execution stack, right? And there's several options. One is full stack, one is debug. And if I click on the debug, I get on my server, there's my, what you see now is actually the exception which is being raised on my server. And I can now do things like, let's go and look at debug. And my server is slightly confused because I've got 2 monitors. So here is I know that the standard Smalltalk debugger on my server. And the problem is I added this crazy method which doesn't exist called Zork, so I can get rid of that. I can start doing things like expecting any current value. So there's the 2 numbers. I can start saying, well, why not make that a 7? And then do an accept. And then just for the fun of it, I'll make that a minus. And then I'll do an accept. And then I can just say, well, that should be fun. Let's just continue running. And you'll see the server then sends back the response to the web browser, and we get the resulting page. Which means that we can do live debugging on our server. And we can inspect the current state of our server, modify the code, modify the values, and see what the results are when we continue, which is, I find, a useful thing to do when we're developing. Okay? If you notice, there's a bunch of... I'm running the server in development mode, and when you do that, there's some tools on the bottom of the page. I can create a new session whenever I want to, which would be nice. If things are getting screwed up, I can start a new session. I can configure the application. And one interesting thing is what they call toggle halos. And this is slightly confusing now. What Seaside does is they have components. When you write a component, when you build a web application, you compose components together to make pages. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 different components used on that particular page. What's interesting, well, let's do OK. No. Let's go back here. And there's some very interesting things we can do. One is we can actually open a browser on the code on the server. And here is the source code for that particular application. And I need to, there we go. So this is the method which renders the entire page. Here's my add to method. And if I want, I can actually, well, look, that was sort of stupid. It says add, and I made plus, so I want minus, so I make it a plus. And now I can actually, do an accept and modify the source code on the server through my web browser while I'm running the server when I'm in development mode, which is sort of interesting that it can be done. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about callbacks. Typically when you build a normal GUI application, we build our model, and then we have our interface layer, and the interface layer has callbacks to our model, right? So when I click on a button in a regular application, I just say, well, when you click on this button, call that method, right? When you build web applications, that breaks down, right? So you generate this web page, and this web page then submits a request, and we get the request, and we process the request, and it breaks that mapping. Seaside said, why don't we just go back to what we used to doing? So in Seaside, when you build an application, you've got callbacks. So here I give an example. I'm using one of the standard examples of, you have this web page, it has a counter, and you do plus or minus, and here there's two links, the plus link and the minus link, and here's the source code for it. All right? And what we're saying is, all right, there's an anchor. And that anchor has text plus plus, and when that anchor is clicked on, there's a callback. You call that block and execute it. We don't worry about, let's process the request, find what they did, and then you just basically you link your anchors to a particular method on your server. The same thing when you build a form, right? You've got text inputs, and those inputs are hardwired to put the results in a field of an object. So we don't worry about, get the request object and pull all the form data out of it. The form entry points are directly, right, send their data back to the fields of a particular object. Well, here I'm just calling a method on the object itself. All right? Which is a strange idea. I mean, we're not used to this generating a web page and having that taken care of for us, right? There's always this, right? We see that a little bit in Rails where you can actually, right, the model will generate the page which does some of this, right? This is how we build a web page in Seaside.
Can you break that syntax down a little bit? The parentheses are confusing me.
Okay, what happens is, here we're sending an anchor method to HTML, which is a render which generates the web page for us. It's generating an anchor tag for us. And then the parentheses says, okay, I'm sending a message callback to it, telling the tag, you've got a callback method, and here's the block you execute. And then there's this semicolon indicates that we're cascading message sends, which means the next message gets sent to the anchor tag again. And that's, okay, so it's telling the anchor, your text is plus plus. So it's a way that Smalltalk has of allowing you to have multiple messages sent to the same receiver without having to repeat the receiver over again.
Basically, like link to remote.
Yeah.
But the callback would be like onClick, right?
Yeah.
So the onClick method is increased.
Yeah, but you're thinking in JavaScript.
No,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
like
Yeah. And if we come back, where's my cursor again? so here's that particular example. Session may have timed out already, but that's... All right, so I can start clicking. Now, the one interesting thing that we can do in Seaside, so I've gone up to 6, right? Go back to 3, and now can I... I've done the back button a couple times, right? Now what's going to happen if I click on plus plus? Yeah, the question is, we're used to it being 7, right? Why? Because we're used to our web applications don't work with the back button.
No, a normal one would have been 5.
Right, yeah, because it...
Yeah.
Right, so it knows, it doesn't... the server and the web page don't get out of sync, right? And so when you use the back page and then go forward again, we don't go from where we're typically thinking the server was, but we go from where the web page was generated from the server. So it actually, the back button in Seaside works automatically correctly, which is sort of interesting. And let's see. A couple other interesting things we can see from here. Here we go. Again, if I toggle halos, there's an extra icon up here now. We can actually run our tests on that application remotely on the server. So I'm running my test suite on that particular class, and here's results. There was 4 tests run, and they all passed. And if I want to, I can then, what's that particular test? I can say, okay, go, and it's going to...
Is that brand new?
No.
Because I was messing around with Seaside like 2 weeks ago, right after bar camp, and I didn't see that.
It
Maybe I had an old version.
Yeah, it depends on which version you're using, yeah. And so here is the source code to that particular test. And we can start looking at the various test methods, which is interesting. We can also look at the history of the various pages that were tested, right? And we go back and forth and look at what they did. And then if we really want to, we can start doing things like we can go and actually inspect the model of that particular web page. So here it is, and there's our count, and I can say, well, let's change it. We can actually start. We can type in Smalltalk code and execute it and get the results. So we can actually query things about our model on our server from the web server and now when we go back to the page, we've changed the actual value of the model, and so the web page shows us 13 instead of the 7 it was. And let's see, so text field callbacks. Here's an example of just, again, creating a form. And the text field, so we say again, give me a text input field and give it a callback method. And so when the user actually types in that field and click the say hello button, right, the value the user entered is passed as argument to this block, and it's it's passed into a field of this particular class. Again, it's just.
Now, that happens as the field loses focus, right? Not when the submit button is clicked.
No, I believe it's when I think it's when the button is clicked. There are, if you want to have it when this is focused, then you have to use another mechanism. So let's see, what else did I want to talk about? Oh yes, components. Come on, let's. So here's a simple page. It all was created by taking 3 different components and composing them together. So we saw the example of the counter example, which is sort of the standard Seaside demo, and I just created 3 instances of those. And then we saw the start session where I do the adding 2 numbers, and then there's enter your name, and we create them, put them on one page by just saying, here's all the components I want on this page, and I want to put them in this order. All right? So it becomes very easy. Once you create a component and you want 5 versions of it, no problem on the same page. And so a lot of what you do when you build a Seaside web application is you build sort of smaller components, make them work, and then you put it together to make a larger page. And they all, in this case, right, all the components, in this case, all work independently because they don't not tied together, but we can also make them as a single application and do something unified.
I think that's doing a search call every time you click those buttons.
What's that?
I think it's doing go back to the server.
Yeah.
Every time you click, right?
Yeah. Every time I click. I mean, you can start doing things. Using Ajax to avoid that, but
right.
These are simple examples, so I didn't bother.
What happens when you hit the back button now?
Right? Again, it's all for free, right? The framework does that for you, so I haven't done anything special really to make that happen. And let's see, what else? I think here's my demo. We've already seen some of the tools. And there's a lot more. We can talk about testing, how to access databases, components. Marguerite is this nice system that allows you to create a model, and from the model generate pages and generate access to databases. Talking about components, Ajax stuff. Examples of Seaside and the web. I think that the most impressive example and a famous one is DabbleDB, which is a commercial venture that was started by Avi Brandt and one of his colleagues, and uses Seaside, and it basically allows you to build this data source through your web browser on the server side. And if you have a chance to play with it, you should, because it's extremely impressive.
Avi's behind Seaside, right?
Yes. Yeah. He is behind Seaside, although there's a community of people who work on it now. He's taken somewhat a step back to work on commercial ventures.
I noticed on one of your first slides you had a gemstone on there.
Yeah.
Do you know if that's like free to use or open source, or what's the licensing on that database? Because I really want to use that bad.
Gemstone or?
The object database gemstone.
I know for commercial uses there is a license fee. They did recently, in May they announced, I forget what they called it, but they now support Seaside and Gemstone. And so on Linux, there's a version you get to play with and use for free. Yeah. And I just haven't taken the time to look into it further. For those of you who don't know, what he's talking about, Gemstone is a object database written in Smalltalk. It's a commercial database. Yeah. Yeah, it's not going to be as fast, and Gemstone scales to billions of objects. I mean, but if you don't want to play around, yeah, there's also Omni, which is Omnibase, which is a free object database, which people use. It's not as nice as Gemstone, because Gemstone's been around for 20 years.
Gemstone sounds pretty interesting because the Smalltalk can actually execute on a certain sort of procedure.
Right. Yeah. Any other questions? Or?
What you said you don't program in Squeak, or you don't run Seaside in Squeak. What is it you're running in?
I'm using VisualWorks, which is a commercial version of Smalltalk. And it's and I do that in part because so here's the main window. Squeak is definitely a far more exciting platform. It's more dynamic. Lots more experiments going on there. The one problem that I have with Squeak is that it moves so fast that in a teaching environment, the students get really excited, but then they just they're not used to having to fight this wall of saying, look, what you're using was just created 3 months ago, and so there's no real documentation for it except the source code. So it doesn't work particularly well in our environment at San Diego State.
But other than the speed of change, do you have any reasons for your preference?
The tool sets in VisualWorks is a bit more polished. The code tends to be a bit more polished because it's been around for 30 years.
So maturity.
Maturity, yeah. And it's VisualWorks also has a JIT, so it executes a bit faster than Squeak.
Now, one of the nice things about Squeak is that you can get people's images, and you're up and running with Seaside by opening an application. Yeah. Is it as easy in VisualWorks?
No, in VisualWorks, Seaside comes with VisualWorks, so you have to actually load it to create your own image. And so there's a bit more you have to do to start Seaside up. Whereas, in Squeak, you can just download it, image, and it's running.
Right.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.